Hello, everybody. On behalf of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, I'd like to welcome you to this live briefing on Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the Western Sahel. My name is Alexander von Rosenbach, and I am the Operations Manager and a Senior Fellow here at ICCT. I'll be chairing today's briefing, and I'm happy to be joined on the panel by two of our leading experts on the topic. Colin Clark is a renowned terrorism scholar and longtime associate fellow here at ICCT. He is also an assistant teaching professor at the Carnegie Mellon's Institute for Politics and Strategy and a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center. Amongst his many accomplishments, Colin has directed studies on terrorist financing, the future of terrorism and transnational crime, the lessons learned from insurgencies between the end of World War II and 2009. Colin's recent work on AQ has used novel organizational frameworks to understand the group's longevity. Today, you'll also hear from Julie Coleman, an ICCT Senior Research Fellow and lead expert on the Sahel. Julie currently manages our flagship program in Mali, where ICCT is working alongside a range of local partners to facilitate the rehabilitation and reintegration of released violent extremist offenders, as well as to reduce the risk of radicalization amongst Malian youth. Before I hand over to our speakers today, I want to briefly introduce ICCT to those who are less familiar with our work. ICCT is an independent think and do tank based in The Hague, working to provide research, policy-based advice, and practical on-the-ground solutions on matters regarding counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, with a special focus on prevention and the rule of law. ICCT has been active in West Africa for the last 5 years and has built extensive experience in the area of R&R. We have been particularly engaged in Mali and Nigeria, where we are working to deliver capacity building trainings and workshops within the prison setting and to facilitate the involvement of civil society organizations in R&R activities. If you would like to learn more about our work in the region, you can contact Julie or myself directly. Both our contact details will be provided at the end of this session. And finally, just a few housekeeping notes to keep this session running smoothly. There will be a Q&A session after the panelists have spoken. If you would like to ask a question, please do feel free to submit it at any time during the briefing using Zoom's Q&A feature. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, but if we don't get to you, we will follow up by email after the event. Please also note that the slides and a recording of the briefing will be made available to all registered participants. Finally, please help us improve future live briefings by completing the very short post-event survey that will pop up on your screen when you leave this briefing. And with that, I will hand over to Colin, who will take a closer look at AQ in the region. Colin, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate it. Let me just start by offering thanks to ICCT, to Alex, to Julie, to all the staff, and to Renske for making this possible and for inviting me. I'd also like to thank a couple of people in particular, Jacob Zen, who's a senior research fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, and Hajar Naili from the Soufan Center. She's our communications and media manager, and also an expert on the Sahel, and helping me prepare for this event. Hope everyone is staying healthy and staying safe, and thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm going to walk through, next slide, please. I'm going to walk through an overview at the kind of strategic level for how I see the situation unfolding in West Africa. A lot of this research stems from the book that I published over the course of the summer called After the Caliphate through Polity Press, where I'm basically exploring the future of the global jihadist movement and what happens next. We're about 1 year out exactly from the collapse of the caliphate. And so what are we likely to see next? I think to start with, and I'll get into what the academic literature tells us about terrorist cooperation and competition, mostly cooperation, but I think we need more work in this area. To me, the terminology is not well defined. We often throw around terms like cooperation and nexus, and I think we need to conduct more rigorous research and analysis on what do we mean by cooperation? What do we mean by nexus? If two groups cooperate and it's a one-off, is that really cooperation? Right? There's different levels. We're talking about sustained cooperation, not merely transactions, and I'll get into all of that as we go along. But what I expect to see, and I think we've been seeing already, is further atomization in the global jihadist movement more broadly. And I would just caution the following. We talk about these groups like they're monolithic entities, and clearly they're not. And so even while we may be seeing something happening in the Sahel, we could see something totally different playing out in Southeast Asia, right, based on kind of local dynamics or more parochial grievances. And so I don't think it makes much sense to talk about ISIS the way that we did maybe 2 or 3 years ago. The dynamics on the ground are changing, and they're changing quickly. Next slide, please. So I'll start by, I'm going to be focusing on AQ in West Africa, and Julie's going to be talking about ISIS. And I'll talk about mostly Janim, Jamaat Nasser al-Islam wal Muslimin, or the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, which is essentially Al-Qaeda's representative in West Africa. This is a group that was formed as an amalgamation of several other AQ affiliates, Ansar al-Din, al-Murabitun, and AQIM Sahara branch. Some kind of fast facts to get you acquainted. We think the group has approximately 2,000 fighters. Now keep in mind, this is an estimate, it's a range and not a hard and fast number. The group generally operates in and around Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and it finances itself through a range of operations, including drug smuggling, taxation of the smuggling routes, and gold mining. We know that targets have included Westerners, but also local, regional, and international security forces. And the group's propaganda often speaks about uniting groups throughout the Sahel and expelling foreign influence, particularly the French. Next slide, please. So this is a quite useful map from the Washington Post from an article a couple of weeks ago, and it shows the distribution of attacks throughout West Africa. And if you're looking at the kind of the pinkish color, you'll see that a lot of the attacks are concentrated in and around Burkina Faso, the border of Mali, and Niger. And that's where we've seen an increase in activity over the past several years. And you can see the Islamic State a bit further over into the pocket of northeastern Nigeria, but as well scattered in and around the same area in the Sahel where Al-Qaeda is. And that's where we think a lot of the cooperation that we're seeing is taking place. Now, how will things transpire from here? Will these groups actually begin to branch out even further throughout the region? It's hard to say, although we do know that this region in general is typically one of weak and failed states, poor governance, porous borders, and security forces that have challenges in and of their own. The United States in particular is looking to draw down troops from West Africa, and that could give these groups an opening as they seek to exploit existing and future power vacuums. Next slide, please. What role does AQIM play in all this? We know that even as this group has remained somewhat of a diminished threat, it has supported and particularly provided logistical support to JNIM. And according to open source reporting from the Defense Intelligence Agency, we know that AQIM uses North Africa as a support zone for JNIM operations in Mali and the Sahel. We know that AQIM also operates transnational financial networks to move and share funds between its various members throughout the Sahel. And so that's something to look at as well. When we talk about cooperation, what do we mean? It doesn't always mean kinetic attacks. Sometimes it can be the kind of less sexy, but still no less important logistical function, including finance and various other components. Next slide, please. So some of the reporting by Joby Warwick, I think this was the article in the Post where the map came from back in February. It caused a big stir. So it suggested that fighters from Al-Qaeda and ISIS were coordinating attacks and carving out mutually agreed upon areas of influence in the Sahel, although some have expressed skepticism at the level of cooperation. Some saw this as the fulfillment of what we've long suspected, and others have said, well, let's pump the brakes here and let's be a little bit careful in how we talk about what kind of cooperation is taking place. And I think both sides are actually right, if that makes sense. So Brigadier General Anderson, head of U.S. Special Operations in Africa, said, what we've seen is not just random acts of violence under a terrorist banner, but a deliberate campaign trying to bring these various groups under a common cause. Although there are apparent strains between JNIM and ISIS in the Greater Sahara, most of this dating back to the fact that AQ has done a good job at staying under the radar, which is where they'd like to stay, and ISIS has borne the brunt of Western counterterrorism operations over the last several years. That's allowed Al-Qaeda to kind of go to ground, to work through local affiliates on the ground, to work with tribes, and to really attempt to ingratiate themselves at that local level. And they've done so quite effectively, not only in the Sahel, but throughout the Middle East and other parts of North Africa as well. Next slide, please. So some of the literature on terrorist cooperation is quite revelatory. And I think this is far from exhaustive, but these are some of the scholars who I've read in the past and revisit quite frequently. Tricia Bacon's work, which notes that alliances risk precipitating counterterrorism pressure, right? Which is what I just mentioned. It's one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda has been somewhat reluctant or hesitant to engage in these open alliances with other groups, including ISIS. Asif Moghadam, who wrote an excellent book, which I can't recommend enough, The Nexus of Global Jihad. His work has, for years, looked at this idea of how terrorist groups cooperate, what they learn from each other. And he does a great job of laying out a spectrum, right? And I think this is probably the closest to what we mean when we say we need more comprehensive work, right? Cooperation just doesn't cut it. It doesn't suffice. What do we mean by that? He lays out this broader spectrum from high-end mergers and strategic partnerships all the way down to kind of lower-end tactical or transactional cooperation. Brian Phillips has done some really excellent work as well that talks about, if you look at some of the work that says there's all these risks inherent to cooperating. Well, why do groups do it, right? Why do they engage? Why do they take or assume these risks? Phillips' work shows that, with cooperation, it can help these groups mitigate their mobilization concerns. It also helps them to facilitate resource aggregation, which is critical. And then lastly, and this is a piece that Evan Prokofsky wrote just recently in Terrorism and Political Violence at a Glance, he lays out 5 reasons why we may very well see sustained cooperation going forward. He talks about the initial disagreement between AQ and ISIS being about strategy. And I've long argued the same, that I think that's one reason why we may see these groups come together. Not only would a marriage of convenience make sense in certain regions, but moreover, once the leadership is out of the way, which it is, it's a second point that senior leadership's been decimated, those disagreements are less severe at the kind of mid-level operational commander and foot soldier level. And we often see, fighters switching sides and militants kind of going back and forth in certain regions of the world. So it's not unprecedented. Prokofsky also says that there is more familiarity at these lower levels. These fighters know each other. That local cooperation could be foundational and you could build out from there. That's something that I also agree with, but my caveat is that, different regions will look quite differently, right? So what we see in Afghanistan could look quite different than what we see in Mali, which in turn could look quite different than what we see in Libya. So I caution against using a kind of blanket approach to analyzing these groups. And then lastly, they're at a stage where they're regrouping, right? Again, it's been a year out since ISIS was decimated. Al-Qaeda, according to what Bruce Hoffman talks about, has been quietly and patiently rebuilding, which I agree with. And so we're at a pivot point now where these groups may very well choose to move in a different strategic direction. Next slide, please. So what are we likely to see moving forward? I think it's certainly not wise to completely rule out cooperation between ISIS and Al-Qaeda moving into the future. But again, I'll kind of harp on this theme of we need to look at the issue from a regional perspective, right? And again, things change on the ground quite quickly. So we need to kind of test and question our longstanding assumptions of how these groups operate. And then I think local power dynamics and parochial grievances are going to be instrumental in shaping this. You know, somebody asked me yesterday when I was having this conversation, well, how does the coronavirus change all this, right? And I think it's still way too early to tell. But if you think about the path that the United States, at least, was going down from, you know, from a foreign policy and security policy perspective, there's already been the shift away from the global war on terrorism to great power competition. We could now see a redistribution or reallocation of resources to deal with security and health implications, right? The threats posed by global pandemics, perhaps more of a focus on second and third order effects from climate change. All of this to say, it probably means less money for counterterrorism, which in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it will, right? Everything involves trade-offs, and so we may see some of these groups exploiting the redistribution of resources and making a play, becoming stronger in certain parts of the world where we've long feared that they would. That's a separate question from whether or not they'll target the West. In some cases they may, in some cases they may remain content on attacking the states or the regions where they currently reside. I think that's my last slide. So yeah, so I just have some, you know, these slides will be made available to everybody, just some links to a few articles. And at the Soufan Center, we just put out a brand new report on countering violent extremism. And one of our case studies is in the Sahel. And we spent a lot of time working on a really cool map that shows the distribution of jihadi groups throughout Africa. All of our stuff is available on our website for free, so feel free to go visit that. And at this point, I will kick it over to Julie, who's going to provide analysis on the Islamic State in the Sahel.
All right, I'm not sure if my video is working. Looks like it is. Okay, great. Firstly, I want to say thank you to Colin for stepping in and joining us here today for this call. And then secondly, I want to join everybody who's actually on the call. It's very heartening to see such a good turnout, and I am sure that's partly because of interest in the Sahel, and then partly because everybody's looking for a bit of a distraction these days and something that's not the bombardment of news about the coronavirus. So in any case, whatever has drawn you here, it's great to see everyone. So as has been mentioned, I'm going to focus on the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS. And I want to start by sort of framing the scale of the issue in the Sahel, then talking about the establishment and the rise to power of ISGS, give a brief overview of what the situation looks like on the ground today, and then go into sort of what is at the heart of today's discussion, which is the cooperation between the two groups. And then some thoughts on what we could see in the future as we look forward. So looking at the graphic that's on your screen right now, it really highlights the size of the issue that we're talking about in the Sahel. So this is fatalities by year up through 2018. So you of course see an expected spike around 2013 when the conflict in the north of Mali, which sort of came to the forefront of public interest when the mausoleums and mosques in Timbuktu were destroyed. But so you see that peak in 2013, and then it really dips off between 2014 before around 2016 starting to go upward again. And the thing that is really especially worth noting is that this ends in 2018, so we don't even look at the most recent year. So from 2018 through 2019, there was a fourfold increase. Estimates are that about 4,000 fatalities were seen in the Western Sahel. So by that, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So it's been a really exponential increase, and it really shows the spike in both number of attacks and then also the lethality of the attacks that are taking place. And I think that the Sahel has also become something that a lot more people are interested in. Firstly, with the fall of the caliphate in Syria and Iraq, I think that a lot of people were looking around to see where would the new home base be for the Islamic State. And given that the Sahel is a region, as Colin mentioned, that is, characterized by poor governance, open borders, vast amounts of ungoverned space, it was sort of a candidate for where they could relocate. But then I think particularly it's continued to be of interest. We've seen that Islamic State Central hasn't just relocated to the Sahel, but we have seen that the groups that are active in that region and who are by and large from that region have really perpetrated high levels of violence over the past couple of years, and certainly geared up and ramped up a lot in 2019. And so as we see the evolution of the conflict, originally started in northern Mali, now we see it really in central Mali, and of course then spreading eastward into Niger and Burkina Faso, and also increasingly threaten the states in the Gulf of Guinea. So the issue seems to unfortunately be spreading as we watch it unfold. Next slide. So just a quick introduction to ISGS for those who aren't familiar. It is the Islamic State's affiliate in the Western Sahel countries. It was established in 2015 under Al-Sarawi, who you see in the image here. And he was formerly a sort of mid to senior level commander in El-Morabitoun. In 2015, he sort of unilaterally declared allegiance to Baghdadi and to the Islamic State, which the actual leader of El-Morabitoun, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, quickly shot down and made it clear that as a group, they were remaining loyal to Al-Qaeda. And in fact, El-Morabitoun now is sort of part of the Jenim affiliate group. But this led Sahrawi to sort of split off and form his own group. It's interesting to note that his pledge of allegiance went unrecognized for about 17 months. So neither Baghdadi nor anyone else in sort of Islamic State Central acknowledged this pledge. And if you look at, for example, when their affiliate in Pakistan and Afghanistan made their pledge of allegiance, it was recognized about 2 weeks later. In Libya, the pledge was recognized about 1 month later. So it's perhaps a little bit telling about perhaps some strained relationships between IS Central and ISGS by the fact that it took so many months for it to be formally recognized. And that's something that I'll discuss a little bit later about what sort of dynamics are possibly going on behind the scenes there. But during this downtime, sort of after the Pledge of Allegiance in May of 2015 and the formal recognition of the affiliate in the Greater Sahara in October of 2016, the group is reported to have undergone a lot of military style training, and they definitely emerged out of that time period as a very powerful and dangerous group, which we really started to see, particularly starting in 2017. So if you can go to the next slide. So I think this is probably the same graphic that Colin drew upon in terms of it gives you a map of different attacks that were taking place along throughout the entire region. And the light blue color is the Islamic State attacks. So their first big foray into the public consciousness was in October of 2017 when they conducted an attack in Tongo Tongo, which is in Niger. And this really was something that made people sit up and really recognize them as a new and emerging force, in particular because not only were 5 troops from Niger killed in this attack, but 4 US Special Forces also died in this attack. So it was really their statement that they were capable of carrying out an attack that would take out military forces from a very strong entity, in this case, the United States. They continued attacks, of course, in 2018 and into 2019 when we saw their lethality really, really grow. In particular, at the end of 2019, there were a series of attacks, more or less back-to-back, that we saw in November and into December, where there were high fatalities. So we had an attack on the Malian military in November, in which 92 died. We had a December attack in Burkina Faso, where 42 died, and notably 35 of those were civilians. And then an attack in Niger in which more than 70 died. So they definitely were launching increasing numbers of attacks, but also using increasingly sophisticated methods of attack. They've more or less followed a similar model to Jenim and to the Al-Qaeda affiliates preceded Jenim in the region, in the sense of they would come in with their fighters armed on motorbikes, sort of launching more or less blitz-style attack on whatever their target was, and then get out of there very quickly before surrounding forces could find them. And because ISGS in particular carries out attacks a lot in the border regions between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, what they often do is they'll conduct an attack, say, in Mali, and then quickly cross over the border into Niger to sort of evade capture. But in addition to these sort of styles that they've been using a long time, what we saw in 2019 was starting to use things like mortar shells to conduct attack. They were also using vehicular-borne IEDs, so carrying out these sort of larger truck bomb suicide attack style operations. They've also been using drones to carry out surveillance before the attacks. So in their use of drones and things like that, we see a bit of similarity between Islamic State Central and how they would normally carry out their operations. But I think it seems clear that there's not necessarily a sharing of equipment or of operational strategy in terms of carrying out attacks from Islamic State Central to ISGS. It's rather that these sorts of weapons and armaments and even drones are becoming increasingly accessible to the group. And one thing that's worth noting as well is that as we see arms trafficking throughout the Sahel has really grown, we also see that in a lot of their raids, they purposely conduct them to acquire more weapons, so that it's sort of a snowball effect in that the fact that they have more powerful weapons or more armaments in general allows them to carry out more attacks and then acquire more weapons. So that's part of the reason perhaps why their attacks have become more effective in the sense of the number of casualties that they're able to cause. So ISGS is probably, estimates are that they're responsible for about 700 deaths in 2019 in the Sahel. We think that they're only around 200 to 300 strong in terms of the number of fighters that they have. There have been reports that they're slightly larger than that. I know that there were reports from 2018 that they reached about 425 individuals. So, you know, regardless of what the specific precise number is, they're quite a small entity, and certainly smaller than I think the 2,000 that Colin mentioned for Jenim. If you look at the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq at the peak of their power in 2015, there were about 30,000 fighters strong. So undoubtedly, they are a much smaller operation. They're able to carry out a lot of their attacks, though, by kind of co-opting non-members into carrying out their attacks. So they will either pay these individuals with money, sometimes with arms, other incentives to get them to join them to carry out their attacks. But these are not individuals that are considered as true members. They're just sort of co-opted and partake in the moment, and then they, you know, disperse, and they're not really permanent fixtures of ISGS. But also, I wanted to just highlight the really small number of ISGS in the Sahel is quite notable when you compare it to the number of sort of international peacekeeping forces and international forces that are present in the Sahel to combat them and other jihadist groups. So MINUSMA, which is the UN's peacekeeping mission, it has more than 14,000 peacekeeping troops. And in the history of the UN, it is the most deadly UN mission, meaning that they have suffered the most casualties being targeted by these groups. You can also look at the number of Barkhane forces that France has sent to the region. So there's more than 4,500 there, and that number is now going to grow by at least a few hundred again. So there have been, you know, great personnel and great financial resources spent by the international community and by foreign countries, also by the African Union, by the European Union, to really combat what is at its heart a very, very small number of people. Between the 200 to 300 in ISGS, a couple of thousand then maybe in Jenim, and then some additional numbers that we would see in other groups who are sort of also operating in the same geographic space. Next slide, please. So now focusing on perhaps what is the most interesting aspect of this is what does their cooperation look like when we talk about the cooperation between ISGS and Jenim? And I think Colin raised a lot of really good points that I would echo, in the sense that we need to be more specific when we talk about cooperation and what exactly that looks like and what precisely we're talking about. So for me, at least, I think what I see as the distinction is there's perhaps possibility for strategic coordinations on a more higher level in terms of overall strategy or goals, versus a more tactical or operational cooperation where you'd see perhaps like joint forces cooperating I think it's really important to keep those two things distinct. So when we're talking about Al-Qaeda and IS in the Sahel, we know a few things about what their relations are and how they're perhaps working together. We know from an AQIM interview in 2016 that AQIM was in touch with al-Sahrawi and acknowledged that he was the Islamic State representative in the region, and sort of said that they had, normal communications. So we know that even back in 2016 that the two groups were at least in contact. We also know that in December 2017, Iyad Agali, who is the leader of Janim, was meeting in person with Sahrawi in Kidal in Mali. Sahrawi also apparently met with some AQ lieutenants maybe a week after that. And there have also been reports that sort of more lower level rank and file members from each of the two groups have been seen together in various communities. So we know that they at least have that level of contact. But beyond that, we have statements from, for example, the AFRICOM commander, who has noted that they're cooperating together. But there isn't really much meat on the bones of that statement, and that we don't know exactly what that cooperation is. So in my view, just based on looking at how the different actors are, carrying out their functions in the region, I think that probably a report by MINUSMA, the UN peacekeeping force there, is probably the most accurate, in which they said the two entities were clearly working in parallel and possibly cooperating. So I see that what I see, from the signs on the ground is probably that there's some sort of like tacit agreement to deconflict and to not target each other. And I think that a lot of people watching have used the word cooperation because it seems very confusing why the two groups aren't in conflict in the Sahel when they are in direct and open conflict with one another in so many other regions around the world. It doesn't seem like there is any tactical cooperation in the sense of we haven't seen ISGS fighters join in and carry out raids or attacks with Janim fighters. So it seems like the two are in carrying out their attacks working independently. If you quickly go to the next slide. So this slide, if you look at the dots in red, those are Janim for the most part. And then the ones in the darker blue are the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. So you can see that geographically there is a slight overlap in the middle, sort of in central Mali, of where central Mali border regions with Niger and Burkina Faso, where they're both carrying out attacks, but there isn't complete overlap. So I would say that it seems like they are at least at the sort of higher strategic level agreeing to not carry out their attacks in the same region as one another. So it seems like they're perhaps taking a divide and conquer approach. In that they do both share a lot of overarching goals, in targeting both domestic forces that are in the region. So for example, the military forces of their respective three countries, the governments of those countries, but also they both have a shared goal of wanting Western forces out of the region, particularly the French, who have the largest international presence in the Sahel region. So they do have these overlapping goals. So it seems like that is clear. And it does seem that there is some sort of tacit deconflicting that's going on. But I would caution against thinking that this cooperation is that they are in sort of ongoing and constant contact, or they're coordinating attacks together. It seems very much they're acting still in their separate tracks, but they just happen to be going along a track that's taking them in a parallel direction because of these shared goals. And shared outcomes that they're trying to reach. I also think it's worth addressing the fact that there could very likely, and I think Colin alluded to this already, but there could be big differences in the senior leadership versus the rank and file members and how cooperative they are amongst each other. I think Colin mentioned from the Perkowski article that, if the senior leadership is decimated, there could be familiarity at lower levels. And while that's certainly true, because both groups are drawing upon their membership from a lot of the same ethnic groups or the same regional areas, even at the senior leadership level within the Sahel region, a lot of them are very familiar with one another. They have previously been either in the same organizations or in different organizations that were aligned with one another. So, you know, there are also a lot of overlaps sort of at the senior level in addition to the lower level. And then lastly, I think the quote unquote cooperation that we maybe see between IS and AQ in the Sahel is a facet of a particularity of the conflict and the evolution of extremist groups in the region, is that allegiance and membership seem to be highly fluid. So we can say that there aren't indicators that individuals who join either group, whether it's Janim or whether they're joining ISGS, most of them are not highly ideologically motivated. So they often join for reasons such as, you know, grievances against the government for either neglect or in fact from direct abuses or violations carried out by the state security forces, or simply because they have an underlying sort of long-standing grievance with other ethnic groups that are operating or living in the same area. There's often competition over resources. And both AQ and IS are tapping into those existing grievances to really gain support for their own movement, but in a way that is not tied to any specific religious ideology. So in general, these are not people who are ideologically motivated. And so their allegiances tend to be more fluid based on who is there at the moment, who is able to provide them with secure arms or other resources, or in fact, sometimes everything from, you know, healthcare to education, you know, who's able to provide these basic necessities that otherwise is lacking in their communities. And that is why they're joining some of these groups rather than their you know, adherence to a specific religious ideology. So for that reason, we also see a lot of fluidity, and that it's perhaps more likely in the Sahel than in some other regions that there would be overlap or at least some cooperation between the two. So if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of quickly highlight here, if you look at this, this is a projected fatalities in the years from 2015 to 2019. So 2019 are just projected figures rather than accurate figures. But I wanted to show it because it does sort of track to what we actually saw carried out in terms of percentage. So if you look at the light blue color, that's the ISGS linked fatalities in 2019, which is a substantial portion. But if you look at red and then the sort of brown color at top, that is together the number of fatalities carried out by Janim. And the brown is in particular one Janim affiliate, FLM or Katiba Masina, who are the most deadly within Janim. But this, I think, highlights the really interesting phenomenon, which I think has some big implications for the future of what we're going to see in the region. But ISGS, although deadly, and although is carrying out a significant number of attacks with a significant number of fatalities, Janim is in fact responsible for more deaths within the region. So it's really interesting that most of the international community is really fixated on the Islamic State brand. Perhaps, you know, as like the new kid on the block, they're more interesting or more unknown. And as Colin pointed out, Al-Qaeda has really been able to fly under the radar in more recent times, particularly in the Sahel, but also worldwide. And Islamic State is drawing a lot of the attention, whether or not that's actually warranted by the number of fatalities that they're responsible for or the number of attacks that they're carrying out. Which is just an interesting phenomenon to kind of keep in mind. Next slide, please. So as we're looking forward, one of the sort of in the media earlier this year within 2020 and including just this month in March, there have been indications by the Malian government that they are looking to engage in negotiations with different terrorist groups. And the president's envoy in central Mali has apparently already sent out individuals to be in contact with sort of two of the most prominent Janim leaders, Agali, who I mentioned previously, and Amadou Koufa, who is the head of FLM or Katiba Masina. So we know that, or you know, it's at least reported that the Malian government has already been in touch with Janim and seems to be willing to enter into negotiations with them. The same is not being said about the government's willingness to engage with ISGS. There haven't been any public statements made that they are ruling that out entirely, but there have been some more like subtle overtures made by the government to indicate that they're less likely to engage in dialogue with ISGS, including the fact that they've mentioned talking to the Malian sons who have taken up arms in the country. And it's really important noting that al-Sarraj is not Malian. He's originally from Western Sahara. He did marry or purportedly married a Fulani woman from the Mali-Niger border, but he himself is an outsider, whereas the more prominent leaders within the different JNIM affiliate groups are Malian. So that could be an indication, again, that the government is willing to engage with Al-Qaeda, but not Islamic State in terms of these negotiations. So if that's the case, which, you know, we're not sure if these negotiations are actually going to take place, JNIM has stated that they won't engage in negotiations until international forces and French forces leave the country, which of course is a big if. France is very against any negotiations taking place. You know, kind of looking at the US negotiations with the Taliban as something that they are not willing to accept in Mali. So it remains to be seen if these negotiations will really take place and if anything will come from them. But it could be that this would drive a wedge between these two groups because their goals would no longer be as aligned as they are in the current atmosphere. And then if we look to how appealing the Islamic State brand is going to remain, it's been mentioned, you know, by myself, by Colin. I think we all recognize that the Islamic State name is coming under a lot of fire in terms of that really draws the targeting from external actors and security actors who are looking to disrupt and dismantle the group. So as long as that brand remains the one that's being most targeted, it makes it less beneficial for the actors who are operating under that name. And Sarraj has long been viewed with, I think, a lot of skepticism about his actual allegiances and whether or not he really is loyal to Islamic State or if he would just pivot back to Al-Qaeda when it suits him. I think there's some speculation that skepticism about his motivations, about whether or not he really supports the Islamic State group and ideology, or rather he's just in it for money or power, and just saw it as an advantageous relationship. That could be one reason why it took so long for IS Central to recognize ISGS. So it's not entirely clear, but what I think is really interesting to keep an eye on is if ISGS will continue to operate under that name, or if the group is going to pivot and sort of realign with Al-Qaeda if they come under too much you know, scrutiny and attention. And then lastly, I just sort of want to end on the note that, you know, recently we're seeing that the Operation Barkhane, the French intervention to sort of eradicate these extremist groups, has recently, the number has increased, so it's going to raise from 4,500 by maybe up to 600 individuals more. You already see MINUSMA that has a huge amount of peacekeeping troops. And despite this really large asymmetry between the numbers of extremists and the numbers of these security forces, it's not really addressing the problem. You know, the security situation keeps on getting worse and worse, and affecting more people and broader areas in the region. So I think it's clear that this pure sort of military securitized approach is not proving to work in the region. So I think that really just highlights the need to sort of reframe and restructure the response to be something that's more effective, to be able to restore good governance and stability and security to the region. So with that, I will leave it there for now, and I think then we will turn it back over to Alex, who will maybe start some Q&A.
Thanks very much, Julie, Colin. I'm going to take a second here to fire up Colin's video and my own, and we can try a little panel grouping here. I hope that seems to work. So firstly, again, thanks for everyone for hanging on the line here. I hope it's been an interesting session. The good news is that we have had over 24 questions already come in, and more every second if I look at my screens here. So likely we will not get to every one of those, but there is definitely some area of clear sort of overlap. So I'm going to try and focus a few questions and group them, but we will, as I said, try and get questions responded to by email as well. So please keep them coming in even if we don't get to So the first interesting question that I think sort of brings a few ideas together is really about how the cooperation or competition within the Western Sahel looks in comparison to other regions where both groups have affiliates or other actors. So we've had questions about what the relationship looks like in Southeast Asia, also in Iraq and Syria. So I wondered, Colin, if you wanted to start by maybe taking a look at giving your 2 cents on what the situation looks like in Southeast Asia and how that might compare and contrast to what we're seeing now in Western Sahel.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a good question. I think I don't see a lot of tangible connections between the Sahel and Southeast Asia per se, but I think a comparative analysis is warranted. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs maybe a couple of months ago with Zachary Abuza, where we kind of sketch out what we think is happening in terms of the Islamic State's resurgence in and around parts of the Philippines, but also in Indonesia and Malaysia. I also wrote a piece in Foreign Policy a bit, maybe a year and a half ago with Patrick Johnston, where we look at how these groups are going to lay claim to the Philippines. I think the most apt comparison between the two regions is in terms of what I talked about earlier, which is poor governance, highly porous borders, and terrorist and insurgent groups that are able to fund themselves through criminal means. There's a lot of overlap there as well. And again, without kind of security cooperation or efforts to build partner capacity in the region, what we end up having is something that scholars have termed durable disorder, right? So not bad enough for these areas to completely collapse, but they never quite get better enough to fix the situation. And I think that's probably the status quo for the foreseeable future in both the Sahel and in parts of Southeast Asia. What I will say is where we've seen movement from the Middle East to other parts, to other affiliates or franchise groups, we have seen some flow to Afghanistan, particularly with the Islamic State dispatching militants to join up with ISKP. And one can only really hypothesize on why that is. My sense is for 2 reasons in particular. One, as we've known for a very long time, but as ISIS has proven, success is sexy, right? And there's a perception that that's the next place where these groups are likely to find success. The other is with the very highly publicized negotiations between the United States and the Taliban, there is a perception that with the pending U.S. withdrawal, there's going to be some opportunities there for ISKP to research. And I would just point you to the attack that I think took place yesterday was an ISKP attack on a Sikh temple in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And ISIS claimed it and claimed retribution for what's happening in Kashmir. So we'll probably expect to see a lot more of that going forward.
Great, thanks, Colin. Julie, did you want to add anything on there? We have definitely space for you to do.
Sure. I mean, I would largely echo what Colin has already said. I think what you see as being a common factor in all of these different regions, whether you're looking to Syria and Iraq, Southeast Asia, what's going on in different sort of African regions, I think what you really increasingly see is these groups are very savvy in terms of tapping into underlying grievances and existing instability. So exactly as Colin mentioned, they are able to tap into sort of longstanding grievances, but also the fact that the governments in these arenas are often largely absent and incapable of effectively governing or providing security or providing levels of stability. So I think that's really a common stream that we see across all of these different regions, is that these groups really know how to tap effectively into that to gain support and also to really ingratiate themselves to the local communities.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to quickly pivot to a bit more operational question. There's a few different angles on the same theme of how different groups are acquiring technology. We mentioned drones and other heavy weaponry, particularly with the question of, are they acquiring them locally? Are they being supplied by different foreign actors? In which case, is there any competition for resources of that nature on the ground? I will maybe pass it to Colin and then look for a follow-up from Julie.
Yeah, so I mean, without having specific details on where the technology is coming from, right? I would say that, and I can speak to this last year, myself and another ICCT fellow, David Gartenstein-Ross, did a big project on terrorist use of drones. We know that the lion's share of drones that are available in the marketplace, which are commercial off-the-shelf drones, come from China. And the Chinese have pretty much refused to play ball in terms of being a responsible stakeholder and limiting or attempting to, dull the proliferation of these drones. But look, I mean, when we hear drone, we think bright, shiny object, right? And our mind goes to, a place of like, wow, how are they getting these? These are readily available now, these quadcopters and everything else. So we shouldn't, they're not quite as easily accessible as an AK-47, but these are no longer this hard to acquire item that perhaps many people think that they are. They're quite accessible, even in lesser developed countries. So we're going to see a lot more of this going forward. And my concern is as the regular public and ordinary citizens begin to use drones more and more, that's going to offer terrorists more opportunities to blend in. One of the terms that we've floated around was UTM, unmanned traffic management, right? So if in 4 or 5 years, and actually given the coronavirus, maybe we get there sooner, you start getting your packages delivered via drone, that offers a lot more opportunities for cover and concealment for nefarious actors, to include terrorists, but also other violent non-state actors, to then join in and use drones for nefarious purposes. Look no further than what happened in Venezuela about 1.5 years ago with the attempted assassination of Nicolas Maduro. We had very crude explosive taped to two drones, which very nearly killed him. And so it's not a feat of engineering to use these things, to train on them, and to use them for deadly ends.
Thanks, Colin.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Julie?
Yeah, I would add to that. In terms of the Sahel region, when we're talking about how or from where they've acquired weapons, we do know that with the fall of the Gaddafi regime, there were a lot of weapons that came in from Libya to the region, as well as, in that the Sahel has for centuries been a massive trafficking route, both of legal and illegal items. It really has been an acceleration of arms trafficking through the region. And as I mentioned, a lot of these attacks are carried out on locations where they know or they believe weapons have been stockpiled. And so they're accessing them through that means, as well as ongoing attacks they're using to acquire more weapons. But beyond that, again, yeah, the drones that we're talking about that ISGS, for example, is using to conduct surveillance, these are commercially available drones. These are not military grade drones that would otherwise be sort of out of their ability to obtain. And what we've seen in West Africa in particular is that the different countries throughout the region, so expanding broader than the Sahel, are really struggling with enacting legislation or some sort of way to stop this massive proliferation of drones that they kind of see coming down the pipeline as then being able to be used. So, in Sierra Leone, for example, they don't have an ongoing problem with, terrorism or violent extremism, but I know they're really concerned about this issue of drones because they're so easily accessible by pretty much any party. So I think that's part of the difficulty, is how you regulate an otherwise, harmless object that can be co-opted and used in these ways. And I think that's something that we're seeing with a lot of different states, including in the region, really struggling with.
Sure. Yeah, an issue that, even here in the Netherlands, I know we're actively trying to figure out the right legislation and things like that. So it's not an issue confined to the region by any means. I want to zoom back out because I've had a few questions coming in. I think we touched on the issue a little bit in the briefing, but really about the question about strategic objectives in the region of the two groups. And trying to understand, are they in competition for example, establishing some sort of caliphate? Are they looking for territorial control? Have we seen signs of either of the organizations trying to establish pseudo-governments or anything that looks like what we might have seen in the Iraq-Syria period a few years ago? Yeah, I would love, Julie, if you could pick that one up first, and then we'll try and get Colin weighed in on that as well.
Yeah. Again, speaking more about ISGS than about JNIM, they have been able to sort of integrate into local communities, but it doesn't appear, at least at this point in time, that they're really making a territorial grab like we saw in Syria and Iraq. Rather, they currently seem to be just looking to expand the theater of where attacks are taking place to destabilize like broader and broader regions. So, you know, expanding from central Mali into Niger, into Burkina Faso, now south into the Gulf of Guinea. And so although they are providing some quasi-governmental aspects to the communities where they're gaining a lot of their support, you know, providing them with physical security, for example, they aren't making the same sort of overtures like we saw in Syria and Iraq, at least not yet. You know, that's not to rule it out completely in the future, but as of now, that doesn't seem to be their goal, rather than just really using these violent acts to destabilize the governments and to show themselves as sort of this like benevolent protector that can actually help these local communities.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I would just add, I think, you know, there's a lag effect with a lot of this stuff. And we often don't know what the objectives are, right? Short of a group like ISIS core getting up, you know, sending Baghdadi to the pulpit and announcing the establishment of a caliphate. Because very often these groups have internal fighting, there's splinters, there's fissures, right? And a lot of the decision making and the command and control is how this fallout takes place. And so I think it's perhaps, you know, somewhat too early to tell what the ultimate goals of these groups are. But if there is future cooperation, whichever group kind of has leverage there, whether it's a kind of the Al-Qaeda flavor or the IS flavor, that could lead us to know a little bit more about what the ultimate intentions are. But it's not totally out of the realm of possibilities. You know, as I talk about and after the caliphate, if one of the affiliate or franchise groups is to attempt to reestablish a caliphate, to me, West Africa would seem like a pretty ideal place, given the fact that, and I'm going to use a term here that I actually don't really like, but that it's an ungoverned territory. I would urge others to avoid using that term because, you know, it's alternatively governed. We just don't recognize the form of governance that's taking place there. But I guarantee you it's very much governed. You know, if a place is ungoverned, no one cares about it. But it's just a different form of governance than what we're used to.
Yeah, I think that's an important longer-term distinction because I know we definitely use that phrase ourselves, but I think it's important to recognize that is indeed the case. Julie, sorry, I cut you off.
No, not at all. I would just quickly add to Colin's remark and say, yeah, again, like until these groups kind of make more public statements or overtures, it's a bit difficult to know what their definite end game is. But we've also seen with Janeem in particular, more so than ISGS, they've done things like provide security and resources for hospitals in the north of Mali. They've also provided some community-based justice, whereas, you know, these communities that are outside of the sort of capital of Mali really have no effective way to access any sort of judicial system. And so they've come in and filled in some of those roles. And we have just a few limited examples of that. So I think it is far too early to say that is their first step to you know, declaring a full alternative structure of governance in the sense of what we saw in Syria and Iraq, but they are certainly, you know, filling those gaps where the central governments are really failing to provide sort of these activities or these baseline necessities for the people.
Okay. Great. Recognizing that we have just come to 5 o'clock here in The Hague, I do want to just quickly close. I will ask maybe one more question as we go, but I wanted to just firstly thank everyone who is still on the line and who has been with us for the hour. On behalf of myself, ICCT, Colin, and Julie, I do want to extend thanks for joining today. We hope you found it interesting and then can take a new idea or way or two. We definitely have a lot of questions to answer, but it also is good for us to spark some research questions that I think we'll be able to take away into the work as well. I do want to close by letting everyone know that we intend to do another live briefing in mid-April. Our hope is...
Let's do it again.
Maybe not, Colin. We'll have to see whether we can squeeze you back in soon, but we are hoping to get that one focused on right-wing extremism this time, another important topic. Obviously, different theater, but it is something that we have spent a lot of time on here at ICCT over the last few weeks, months, and years. So we're hoping to firm that up. So please do subscribe to our newsletter once you exit this webinar. If you want more details, we will be sharing details as that topic gets firmed up over the next few days. So again, thanks very much. I will just kick one more question before we go here. The question is about I guess the way in which groups are decentralized, and whether the decentralization of the affiliates in the Sahel allows for more local level or sort of mid-level cooperation, whereas you might see the strategic competition happening at the, I guess, at the highest levels of the group. I know, Colin, you had mentioned that briefly in your opening remarks. I wondered if you could just come back to that and talk a little bit about those strategic disagreements and how they might be sort of dissipated at the more tactical level.
Yeah, so it's a great point, and it's a great question. I think we need to look very closely at organizational structure, so whether or not a group is, moving toward decentralization because they've suffered from, counterterrorism strikes, kinetic, relentless, and aggressive kinetic strikes,
Yeah.
or is this a more deliberate decision making by the group to insulate or protect some of its leaders and to kind of diffuse command and control, right? Which can really be beneficial to groups, especially if, as Julie mentioned previously, there's a focus on the provision of services. And there's a robust academic literature on provision of services.
Yeah.
Hezbollah is probably the model there, but we've seen a lot of other groups go down that path. I think we've seen, historically, groups like the Tamil Tigers have done it. And it's one of my main concerns when we see movement in that direction from Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-linked affiliates, where they are really focusing at the local level, because that doesn't grab the headlines, but it does help contribute to a group's longevity and its duration, because they are now built into local power structures.
Yeah.
And so this is something that makes a group less likely to be defeated when they are part and parcel of local communities. So I'd say, for those looking for answers to this, look, one, at organizational structure, and two, look at attempts at service provision and local governance structures, and that will get you part of the way there.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think this is a huge factor why the groups have been so quote unquote successful in the Sahel, and why despite the really massive efforts that have been made to sort of either limit or control or in fact eradicate these groups, why those efforts have failed is because these groups are really highly adaptable and flexible, and a lot of that is directly derived from their structures and who comprises sort of like the lower level individuals who provide their bases of support, and the fact that they are integrated into these local communities, and if not actively cooperating, then at least strong motivations to be engaging in deconflicting. So yeah, I would certainly say that is something that we see in the region, and that's a big reason for the success of these groups so far.
Okay, thanks very much. We are going to wrap it up here. Again, we have had an amazing set of questions, so really thanks very much for everyone. I hope we've, with some of them, we will work through them. Judging by the number, it might take us a little bit of time, but that's a good problem for us to have. But we look forward to starting some of those conversations with you bilaterally, email, and hopefully we can build on that going forward as an institution. So thanks again for your participation. Do keep an eye out for the next briefing that we will start promoting shortly. And thanks very much. Have a good and safe and healthy day. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.